First of all, let me apologize. I've been looking forward to staying all day, and something's come up, and I can't stay. But I'm very glad to be here to introduce Bryan Rendon to you, and to just say we have a lot of outstanding students, and for him to be chosen to do this shows a lot of the love and respect he's gained in our department, and your presence here. Anybody here love Bryan?
Somebody cutting onions in here.
Very good. Let me just say a word. He is a Bible and Family Ministry major. And here's what Bryan says a little bit about himself. In my time at Harding, God has fueled me with passion for God's people, has ignited my and is determined to partner with churches and strategize with them on how to best reach the youth of today by turning information into action and body, and going forward to expect great things from God and attempt great things with God. So we're very happy, Bryan. Please introduce yourself for the purpose of recording, and then tell us what you are.
Okay. Yes, I'm Bryan Rendon. This is me. This is Daniel, Life and No Compromise. Well, first of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for blessing me with your presence and for 45 minutes of your time to present this lecture. I'm overwhelmed with your support and love. Everybody that is in here is someone that is very close to me. All of you are very close to me, and it really touches my heart. So thank you. Okay, well, in order to begin, I want to start off by posing a question to you. And the question is this: what is greatness? What is greatness? Are there any brave souls in here today that is willing to try and define what greatness is? What is greatness?
To have a lot of ability for something, to do something with a lot of ability.
Okay, yeah, that's a very fair definition. Thank you. Okay, well, what if we defined greatness as someone or something that is exceedingly excellent? Somebody that stands out. Would this be a fair definition? Okay, here's another question. What makes somebody great? What makes somebody great? Is it wits? Being fast with your words? Being able to banter? Or perhaps intelligence, being the smartest person in the room? Or maybe what makes somebody great is looks, being attractive to the eye. Or maybe it's being the strongest person in the room. I want to bring in some powerful voices that have something to say about greatness. You may know some of these folks. Anybody read Russian authors, such as Leo Tolstoy? Anyone read this guy? Tyler, you probably read Leo Tolstoy. Well, Leo Tolstoy says, there is no greatness where there is no simplicity, goodness, and truth. Following him, I want to bring in St. Augustine, the great early church father. He says, do you wish to rise? Begin by descending. You plan a tower that will pierce the clouds? Lay first the foundation of humility. Martin Luther King Jr., the great civil rights activist, says, not everybody can be famous, but everybody can be great, because greatness is determined by service. Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, says, the price of greatness is responsibility. And last but not least, arguably one of the most highly influential, greatest theologians of his time, Bryan Rendon says, my uncle once said, with great power comes great responsibility. I think he's right. I don't know this man, but if you want to take notes, you got to write that down. That's really good. That's really good stuff right there. As we go throughout this lecture today, we are going to be asking three major questions. And these are the questions that will be driving this lecture today. And these questions will be very, very much so on the topic of greatness. So here are these three questions. What made Daniel so great in a foreign land? We're going to be asking, what did he demonstrate in his daily life that made him stand out from others? And then we will also be asking the question, well, does the teachings of Jesus shed any light into Daniel's character and life? So these are the driving questions that will influence this lecture today. And I think to begin by answering these questions, we have to first paint a picture of the person of Daniel. Who is Daniel? What does the text reveal about Daniel? These things. So I'm going to paint a picture for Daniel, or of Daniel for us right now. So according to the text, Daniel is someone who is the cream of the crop of Israel. He's someone who's young, good looking, and he's wise and strong. He's of the nobility. And the text also says that Daniel was a seer of visions and dreams. So in the book of Daniel, Daniel not only interpreted King Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, but later on in the text, he's interpreting his own dreams. And furthermore, Daniel is someone who is faithful and virtuous. Somebody who, in the face of death, in the face of lions, in the face of his accusers, he decided to be bold. And he decided to remain faithful to his God, even in the face of death. He was someone who was above reproach. And he's also someone who stood out from others. He was distinguished. He's somebody who was very great. And we also see in the text that Daniel was humble. He relied upon Yahweh, his God. And he was a man of high esteem. Other translations say that Daniel was somebody who was greatly loved by God. And he was very courageous and bold. These are the things that the text reveals about the person of Daniel. And this guy is really, really awesome. I mean, this guy is incredible. He has all these attributes about him that really just make him shine. Do you know anyone who is like this in your life? Someone who is faithful and virtuous? Someone who is courageous and bold? I hope you do. I know many of these people. In fact, as I look around this room, I'm looking at many of them right now. In fact, all of you, I think, reflect at least one of these attributes. I just want to take a moment just to brag on someone in here for a moment. Everybody's looking nervous. I'm going to call you out. I want to take a moment to brag on someone. In your midst today is someone who means a lot to me, someone who I consider as my hero, spiritual mentor, and father. And this person is Tom Kimmy. He's right there, recorded. He's someone who has really impacted me and touched me. And I think he's one of those people who I think undeniably reflects all of these things. He's very faithful and virtuous, and he's someone who's really incredible. So I really appreciate you, Tom. And I love you too. So I hope you know these people in your life. I hope that there's somebody that you know that reflects these things. But this here is the person of Daniel. This is what the text reveals about Daniel. So now we can begin to answer these questions of, okay, well, what made Daniel great? What made him stand out? But before we dive into the text of Daniel, we have to first understand the world in which Daniel was a part of. And that's the world of Babylon. So, and moving forward, we're going to talk about Babylon. So in 626 BCE, the first king of Babylon rose to power. Does anyone know who the first king of Babylon was? Anybody know? King Nabopolassar was the first king of Babylon who rose to power in 626 BC. He was a Chaldean nobleman, and he rose to power, and he took back the land of the Chaldeans from Assyrian rule. And this guy was someone who made Babylon begin to flourish and prosper. And this set forth the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And when King Nabopolassar died, the second king came to power. And this is someone who we are all familiar with. This is King Nebuchadnezzar, his son. When King Nebuchadnezzar came into power, he took Babylon and he rebuilt it. After many years of invasions and wars, Babylon was made again to be strong and beautiful and grand and lovely. This city is attested by many ancient authors of antiquity to be a very beautiful place. One of the many things that Babylon is known for is it was a central place for religious and cultural activity. It was also known for its architecture. For example, if you can see this little blue entrance is known as the Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate was made in dedication to one of the many, many gods of Babylon. And it's named after Ishtar, the goddess of war and sex. And this is also a tribute to one of the chief gods. In fact, he's the only chief god. Does anyone know who the chief god of Babylon was? What? Anybody? I think I heard it.
Was it Marduk?
Yes, Marduk. Marduk is the chief god of Babylon. And this entrance to the city was also made to tribute and honor Marduk. But Babylon was a place that was filled with gods. Marduk is the chief god, but among Marduk are the gods of Enlil, who is one of the gods that helped create the world and creation. Following him, you have gods like Tiamat or gods like Ishtar. These are one of the many gods who dominated Babylon. This land is a pagan land. This land was filled with idolatry. It was a central place for all this stuff. But also, and it's up for meaning it's debated, but it's believed that Babylon was home of one of the 7 wonders of the world. And it was the Hanging Gardens. Do any of y'all know what the Hanging Gardens is? The Hanging Gardens was this hanging trees or vines that were set out on the structures in Babylon. And it was beautiful. It was very, very lovely and grand. It made the city really luscious and thrive. But it's believed that Babylon was the home of the Hanging Gardens. And it's also believed as well that King Nebuchadnezzar made these Hanging Gardens for his wife. His wife was somebody, in the least to say, was into the floral industry, the floral business. She really liked flowers and all these things. And I think that King Nebuchadnezzar took heed of the great proverb, which is, a happy wife means a happy life. And he took that and he ran with it and he made the Hanging Gardens. But again, it's up for debate. It's up for debate because you would imagine that there would be remains of this stuff. But no discovery has been unveiled yet of any evidence to suggest that Babylon was the home of the Hanging Gardens. But again, many ancient authors of antiquity attest to this stuff. So Babylon was big, it was prospering, and it was lovely. I want to just bring in one of the ancient authors of antiquity. This is a Greek historian. His name is Herodotus. He says, in addition to its size, Babylon surpasses in splendor to any city in the known world. You see this picture right here. This is a painting that's supposed to represent Babylon and its hanging gardens. You can also see there was waters that were flowing throughout the city, these water channels that supplied the water for the city. So Babylon was thriving. It was growing. King Nebuchadnezzar made this place to be really, really grand among the world. It had strong military might. Its architecture was something that has never been seen before. What you see right here, this is known as a ziggurat. And this is a very, very famous ziggurat. It's known as Entimanaki. And this ziggurat was made in dedication to honor Marduk. But this is something that is one of the highlights of the city, of the empire. And so Babylon had great structures. It had great military might. And King Nebuchadnezzar was thriving, and he was growing his empire. But a lot like his father, King Nebuchadnezzar was hungry for more. He was not satisfied with his empire being strong and its status of glory. He was not satisfied with that. And so a lot like his father before him, he had an expansionist profile, meaning he wanted to go to more lands and conquer more lands. And so King Nebuchadnezzar went to the Mediterranean Sea area, and the lands that are near there are the lands of the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And Nebuchadnezzar expanded Babylon to the territories of the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And so he went and took the lands and he conquered it. Does anyone know what happens in 597 BC? Does this date sound familiar to you? 597 BC? In 597 BC, the Babylonian captivity occurred. King Nebuchadnezzar came and he took the land, and he made all the people come out, and he made them as his captives, and he brought them into the prospering, booming Neo-Babylonian Empire. And then also in 587, the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem also occurred. And that was a devastating blow to the land, to the people of Israel, to the Jews. They were taken out of their home and brought in to Babylon. So all of this is the world in which Daniel was a part of. But this is also the world in which Daniel thrived. This empire was incredibly great. It was incredibly big and strong. It had everything going for it. But the kingdom of Israel and Judah were taken from their land, and they were made captives into this foreign land that they've never been before. So this is the world of Daniel, the world in which he was a part of. So before we move on, does anyone have any questions or anything that they want to say about the world of Babylon or about Daniel, the person of Daniel? Any questions? Any comments? Okay, as I look around, thankfully no one has fallen asleep yet, and no one has cried out heresy, and no one stood up to throw a Bible at me, so thank you. Thank you. That's a good sign. We'll keep moving forward. Jake, don't think it. I see you thinking over there. Don't throw a Bible at me. Okay, so now that we know the world in which Daniel was a part of, we can now enter into the world of the text. We can enter into the text that shows us, okay, what made Daniel so great? And we can now begin to answer what made Daniel so great. So now we're going to be in Daniel chapter 1. And just as a very important side note, the book of Daniel can be divided into two sections. Chapters 1 through 6 are known as the court narratives. This deals with the exiles in court and their dealings with the king and the government. And the second half of the book is known as the apocalyptic section, chapters 7 through 12. This deals with dreams and visions that Daniel had. We're going to be concerning ourselves with the court narratives. And we're going to be looking at passages that show us, or that give us a window into the life of Daniel, and that show us, okay, what is known about Daniel and what did he do? Chapters 1 through 6 are known as the court narratives. And so we're going to be looking into these passages here. Is anyone willing to read? Can I have someone help with reading? Embrace Jake? Okay. All right, Jake. So could you read verses 3 through 4 when I get to it?
Sure.
So it's that red highlight. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that?
I can. What version are you using?
ESV.
ESV. Okay, I got it.
Appreciate it. All right, so Daniel chapter 1, this is what it says. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. If you remember, this is 587 BC. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels and the treasures in the treasury of his God. So Nebuchadnezzar came to the temple, and he took the treasury from the temple and brought it into his God's temple. And that's his way of saying, yeah, I don't care about Yahweh, your God. I don't even know, I don't care about him. I'm going to take his stuff and put it into my God's temple. So this is his way of saying, yeah, I don't care. And then verse 3, Jake, you mind reading that?
Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding and learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them literature and language of the Chaldeans.
Thank you, Jake. Okay, so what's going on here is we see the king tell his chief eunuch, he tells him, hey, go take some of those seemingly smart people, those good-looking people, and turn them into faithful Babylonian citizens. So he's saying, yeah, you go over there and you take them and you turn them into citizens of Babylon. In verse 5, he says the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. So the king is giving them his education. And if you remember the world of Babylon, this is a place filled with polytheism, many gods. And so the king is going to educate them about his gods, Enlil, Marduk, etc. Could someone read verse 6 for us? Anyone else want to read? Yes.
Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah.
And verse 7 too, please.
And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego.
Okay, what's going on here? The author is trying to show us something. You notice how in verse 6 it says, among these were Daniel and his companions. Meaning what? It means that Daniel and his companions weren't the only ones that were chosen. It was Daniel and many other people that were chosen. But the author is highlighting that Daniel and his companions were taken from these other great people. And the king changes their names to these pagan names. If you see Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, you can hear the Yahwistic nuances in them. Built in their names is tributes to Yahweh. One of the names of God, of Yahweh, is Elohim, El, and then Yahweh. Daniel, which means God is my judge. Hananiah, Mishael. Do you hear the Yahwistic nuances in them? So the king is saying, yeah, scratch out those names. Let's put names that give tribute to our gods. So you see Daniel's now Bel, Teshazar, Hananiah, Shadrach, Meshach. You see how they're changing their names to give tribute to their gods. For example, Daniel, Belteshazzar. Bel is just another name for Marduk, which just means Lord. We see this in the scriptures. So he's changing their names to give tribute to the Babylonian gods. And then in verse 8, can someone read verse 8? Anyone else want to read? Thank you, sir.
But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs.
Okay, thank you. So, from the beginning, Daniel chooses to be faithful to Yahweh. Even though he was educated for 3 years, he didn't allow that to take away his identity. Even though he was trying to be assimilated into the world of Babylon, Daniel decided, I'm going to hold on to my faith in Yahweh. And he decided from here to not give in. And God saw that and God blessed him because of that choice. But I want to argue something though. I think in this verse, I want to argue that Daniel had already decided to be faithful. He already resolved to be faithful prior to this verse. I think even before he was taken captive, he resolved to be faithful. So it's not like he came to Babylon and chose to be faithful. He's like, well, I guess I'm going to be faithful now. I wasn't faithful before, so I'm going to be faithful now. No, I don't think that. I think he already decided to be faithful before this. Because we see in verses 3 through 4, he's someone who was very gifted. But Daniel was someone who I think was already faithful from the beginning, and even before the beginning, when he entered Babylon. And so he decides to not give in. In verse 10 it says, "And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age?" And he goes on to tell him, man, what are you doing? You're putting my head on the line. My head's going to be chopped off. It's like, just eat the food. What are you doing? And Daniel says, no, I don't want to do that. And he says, test us for 10 days and see which God prevails. And in verse 15, at the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Okay, now, verse 17 is a very important verse. Can someone read? Thank you.
As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams.
Okay, so we see that because these men were faithful, what did God do? He responded in faithfulness and decided to bless them. He saw their response, and God responded to their faithfulness, and God blessed them. But for Daniel, he gave understanding of visions and dreams. And then in the rest of these verses, it says, at the end of the time, when the king commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. All right, so we have to ask this question. What is the purpose of this passage? What is it revealing about Daniel? What do you think it's revealing about Daniel? What I think it's revealing about Daniel is that it's giving us from the beginning his courage, his faithfulness. But I argue that he was already faithful prior entering into Babylon. We just happen to see him choose to be faithful at this point in his life. And this is supposed to be raising the question, okay, we see what Daniel did, but what made him like this from the beginning? What made him so great? I think this is the question that the author wants us to ask is, okay, I know what he did, but why did he do that? What was the reasoning for this? So this is supposed to be raising the question, what made Daniel so great? I think chapter 1 is a very small, somewhat of a blurry window into Daniel's character and life. But we'll begin to notice as we look through the narratives more in these other passages, these windows become bigger and these windows become even more clear into Daniel's character and life. So in chapter 2, we see another window for Daniel. And just to give you some context, King Nebuchadnezzar had a scary dream. He had a nightmare. And he called in, I like to call his dream team, magicians, enchanters, etc. They couldn't interpret his dream because they were posers. And Daniel said, I knew you were posing, kill them all. Yeah, and kill Daniel and those other guys too. They're probably posers as well. Daniel wasn't even present in there. He's like, yeah, kill them too. And so everybody's panicking, oh my gosh, they're going to kill us, they're going to chop off our heads. And this is when we get to these verses. Verse 12. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, the wise men were about to be killed, and they went to search for Daniel and his companions to kill them. And then it says, then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He said to Arioch, why is the decree of the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel, and Daniel went in and requested to the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation of the king. So, here's a quick lesson in here. If you're ever in a situation where your head might be chopped off, just ask why. Just ask why. It's a good question. It's prudence and discretion. Ask why. But notice that here's a window here. Here's a window into Daniel's life. He replied with prudence and discretion. You ever been in a situation where high pressure, high emotions, everybody around you is going crazy, it's a storm? You ever been in a situation and everybody's reacting, but there's one person that is calm and collected? Probably thinking of a person right now that's like that. Daniel was a person who had a non-anxious presence. He was calm and collected. And this passage is showing us, man, Daniel was someone who didn't choose to react. He didn't choose to go crazy and panic, but he responded with wisdom. And he asked a simple question. It was made known to him. But there's more into this window concerning this. In verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his friends. Verse 18, and he told them to seek mercy from God, from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So how did Daniel respond? After he responded with wisdom, what did he do? He went to his community. And what did he ask them to do? Pray. What does it mean to seek mercy from the God of heaven if it's not prayer? I think he said, hey, let's pray. I think he said, hey, I need you guys right now. We need to stick together in this situation. So here's what the window is revealing to us. What did Daniel value? Prayer and community. But also something even more beautiful than this, humility. He relied upon his community and he relied upon God. And what did God do? He responded. And God revealed this dream to him. And then Daniel responded to God by blessing him. You know, just as something, I think as a lesson in here too, do you often feel like our prayer with our community is more requests than it is thanks? I wonder if there's something in here that we can take away and say, man, you know, God has been blessing us today. He's given us life. Why don't we just thank him instead of just requesting more things? Nothing wrong with requests, but I think maybe we can make our prayer community more of thanks. But this is another window into Daniel's life, and that's showing us that what Daniel valued was prayer, community, and he demonstrated humility and wisdom. We're going to look at one more passage. This is the biggest, most explicit window into Daniel's life and what made him great. This is a passage that's very popular, very famous. When it's anybody who talks about Daniel, this is what they think about, the lion's den. So just some context here. Babylon has been taken over by the Persians, and now the Persians are in rule. So pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be brought throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give an account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Did someone read verse 3? Thanks, Tyler.
Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom.
Here we go again. This guy is standing out from those who already stood out. He's with people that are high status. But something about Daniel is making him stand out from those who are already standing out. Verse 4, then the high officials and the satraps sought to find ground for complaint against Daniel. So these guys got jealous of this Daniel standing out from them. So they're like, what? About us? We're nice too. Like, but this Daniel, what's different about him? Why is the king wanting to set this dude over the whole kingdom? And so they try to find a way to, make this guy look bad. But they couldn't find any fault or complaint for Daniel. Because why? Because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. And so what they do, they said, okay, we shall find no complaint, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. What are they saying here? Basically, they're saying, okay, literally this guy is so above reproach, I can't find anything wrong against him. So we're going to try and use his religious practices against him because that's something that he's always doing. And maybe there's a little mistake in there that we can pull out. And so in verse 10 it says, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Verse 11, then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Okay, this is the most explicit window out of all the court narratives that gives us a scope into Daniel's greatness. We see that Daniel was already standing out, and we also see that people wanted to kill him. And what did Daniel do in response? He prayed. Even though community is not in here, even though he didn't seek his companions like in chapter 2, it doesn't mean it's not important to him. So when we ask the question, okay, what made Daniel great? I argue it's his consistency to humility, relying upon God, relying upon others, his consistency to prayer, his consistency to community, and relying upon God and relying on other people, his friends. This is something that the author wants us to notice here. In verse 10, he prayed, but it's not like he's doing this for the first time. It says, as he had done previously. He's always been doing this before he even entered Babylon. So the question of what made him so great in a foreign land, it's this. It's the fact that he was devoted to the spiritual disciplines of prayer, of humility, and community. He was consistent with these things. And then these guys happened to just come upon Daniel praying. This is not anything that's unique to me. There's two of the world's most renowned scholars in the field of Daniel, biblical studies. This is Dr. John J. Collins. He's one of the Daniel scholars who really set the groundwork for all of the other scholars to work up from. So he set a lot of the groundwork. He's very renowned in Daniel's studies. He says, the tales insist on the importance of fidelity and refuse any compromise to idolatry. It is because of their fidelity to their own God that the Jews succeed. So Dr. Collins is attributing the success of all the Jews because of Daniel and his friends' faithfulness. And following him, Dr. John Goldenday, who's also very renowned in Daniel studies, he says, Daniel's distinction derives from his remarkable spirit, and that reflects God's involvement in his life and in the shaping of the person he was. Daniel is presumably set forward as a model to which, in at least some of these respects, other people might aspire. So, in other words, what made Daniel so great was his consistency and his continual reliance upon God in prayer and humility and in community. This is what made him great. This is what made him stand out from others. His devotion and love to God, and to committing to God by committing to the spiritual disciplines. This is what made him great. What questions do you have? Do you have any questions? Anything that you want to say? Any observations to any of this? Okay. Yes, sir.
I think it's very interesting. I hadn't really noticed before just the little things that we usually scan over, as in like Daniel was prudent and acted with wisdom. We usually look at like what he actually did or what he said, but we forget that those are important insights into who he was as a person.
Yeah, that's a great observation. It's really good. Yes?
How old is it believed Daniel was during this time?
Yeah, some say that he was a teenager. In fact, I think that's a major position in Daniel scholarship, is that he was a teenager in his teens, like 17 or something. And they argue this because they say, well, the text says Daniel was young and good looking. I don't know. He could be old and still be young, like Tom over here, or Joey. That's Any other observations or questions you might want to bring forward? Yes.
So you're talking about how like all their names were changed to fit like the names of the Babylonian gods. So like what audience was Daniel written for that they like kept his name as Daniel, but we all know like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego?
Yeah. So the believed audience for the book of Daniel is believed to be those in the post-exilic period. So after exile, it's believed that Daniel was written. And this is up for moot as well. This is up for debate. But some scholars say, yeah, but how could Daniel be written during the period of the Babylonian exile if there are if there are two languages that the book of Daniel is written in? You know that the book of Daniel is written in two languages? It's Hebrew, and do you know the other language? Aramaic. Yeah, they're like, this doesn't make any sense. Why is Chapter 1 is written in Hebrew, chapters 2 through 6, Aramaic, and then returning back to Hebrew. Very strange. So it really just causes some discussion of okay, well, when was it written? But the audience is believed to be those in post-exilic period. So after the exile. And this book was really used by those during the Maccabean period, because there are some passages that are reflective of the events during the intertestamental period of Maccabees. So that's a great question. Thank you. Okay. Well, I would like to bring one last thing to the table before the end of this lecture, and that's how does this relate to Jesus, to the teachings of Jesus? And here's what I argue. Daniel's lifestyle of no compromise reflects the very teachings of the Messiah. It's the teachings of Jesus that he's living. And here's why I think that. It's because he reflected prayer, his consistency to prayer. His light was absolutely shining. He was standing out from people. And his talents that he was given, he was using it always not to bring glory to himself, but to bring glory to God. You see this throughout the core narratives. But I think the number one key to Daniel and his greatness was his humility. This is the passage that Jesus uses when he's talking to people who are proud and mighty and want to make a name for themselves. He gave them this parable. And the parable is essentially one guy comes before God and is like, God, thank you. I'm not like these sinners over here. I'm not like that person over there. You know, like, look at me, God. Like, wow, I'm something. And then he says, then there is this sinner, this tax collector, this publican who came before God, couldn't even look up to God. And he says, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And then Jesus says, I tell you, this sinner not the Pharisee, return home justified before God. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So, humility is the dethronement of self and the enthronement of God. It's utmost reliance upon God. And that's what Daniel is demonstrating. Once you see this motif, it's a recurring motif, not just in the New Testament, but also in the Old Testament. You see God the Father, Yahweh, saying this. And he says, I dwell in heaven, the highest of highest. But who do I also dwell with? He says, with those who are of a contrite and lowly spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly, to revive the heart of the contrite. But I think one of the most revealing, most richest passages in all of the New Testament concerning Christ is Philippians 2. This just says in your face, humility. If you remember from the beginning, St. Augustine said, if you want to be great, what do? Lay the foundation of humility. And I think it's because of this very passage where this is known as the Christ hymn. Christ humbled himself. He became nothing. And God the Father saw his humility and he was exalted. This is known as hyper-exaltation. Jesus was exalted to glory. And so to put it all in a somewhat of a bouquet, Daniel reflected the teachings of Jesus in Babylon and Persia. He lived as a citizen of the upside-down kingdom of God. God saw his humility, his utmost love for him. Therefore, God exalted Daniel. This is what I'm arguing for, and this is the main point of this lecture, is that I believe Daniel reflected the teachings of Jesus. He lived not as a citizen of Babylon or Persia, but as a citizen of Christ's kingdom. And he reflected it even before Jesus said it. Any questions? Anything else you want to say? Okay. If you care, probably don't care, but I got a works cited page. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate you all.